I want to begin this account by saying again what I've admitted earlier. I certainly have not read everything that's been written about these symphonies or any other music I've covered in my channel, nor am I about to pretend that I have. What I'm offering here is my own understanding of how these pieces work, and beyond doing enough research to know when the pieces were written and something of the circumstances of their composition, the analyses and commentary I offer reflect my way of looking at them. This means that I can't always know whether other commentators have come to the same conclusions I have, and I thus cannot know whether or not I'm alone in proposing to you what I'm about to propose regarding Joseph Haydn's 95th Symphony. The 95th is the outlier among Haydn's London symphonies. It's the only one of the 12 set in a minor key, and the only one whose first movement begins without a slow introduction. Nowadays, it's the London symphony least likely to appear in a major orchestra's seasonal lineup, and it is likewise the case that at its first performance it was not received as enthusiastically as the two that had preceded it, The Miracle and The Surprise, numbers 96 and 94 respectively in the standard published order. And it was the least likely to be brought back for encore performances at the insistence of the audience. I believe this needs to be addressed, and the conclusion I'm going to offer is, to me, more compelling than other explanations I've heard. In an effort to understand this, let's start with the current landscape. We, of course, have the advantage of having the fruit of the complete Austro-Germanic symphonic tradition before us, a tradition that might be said to have begun with Haydn and ended with Gustav Mahler's death in 1911. In other words, a tradition that was born in the second half of the 18th century and extended throughout the 19th and a little way into the 20th. If a modern listener thinks about symphonies in C minor, the Beethoven Fifth is almost certainly the first that will come to mind, followed perhaps by Brahms's First and Mahler's Second. Haydn's 95th is unlikely to occur to that listener, for it certainly does not rank among those later masterpieces. But it's important, as I've said before, always to listen to music in terms of what came before, not after it. And it is simply a fact that between Haydn's 95th, composed in 1791 to 92, and Beethoven's Fifth, written over a decade and a half later, lies not only that span of time, but more importantly, Beethoven's own Eroica. That was the big watershed in the symphonic tradition, and every symphony composed after the Eroica was going to have to take into account this whole new way of looking at the symphony. And that would, of course, apply to Beethoven's own compositions, including the Fifth. It is, in a word, grossly unfair to compare the great C minor symphony of Beethoven with Haydn's 95th. But it's still more complicated than that. The Londoners who first heard Haydn's 95th Symphony knew a thing or two about minor key symphonies and about C minor works in particular. They understood minor keys to have a special significance and expected weighty statements in those special sounding keys. They had Haydn's own example, for during the 1770s Haydn had composed a number of unusually earnest sounding symphonies in minor keys, including the 44th in E minor, the great Farewell in F sharp minor, the only 18th century symphony in that remote key, and, perhaps greatest of all, the F minor Passion Symphony, number 49. Regarding C minor works, those Londoners also had Mozart's 24th Piano Concerto to set their expectations, along with his C minor Fugue for Strings. They would have expected a work imbued with the deepest gravitas, and that is not what they heard. It must have been puzzling in the extreme. To put it another way, if you had no acquaintance whatsoever with Haydn's music, and I were to hand you a list of Haydn's London symphonies identified by publication number and key, you might well expect the 95th to be the most serious work of the bunch. But the opposite seems to be the case. To my mind, the 95th is actually the least serious of them all. I believe this can only be explained one way, and again, I cannot know whether or not other commentators have arrived at this conclusion, although the ones I've read certainly didn't draw it. That is, Haydn's 95th Symphony is actually a musical joke, whose humor was too subtle for even that sophisticated London audience. If that's the case, why didn't Haydn later clarify his intent after a somewhat lukewarm response? I believe the answer is twofold. First, if you've ever had to explain a joke you just told, you know that the explanation cannot redeem the joke, whose whole point was a laugh that's never going to come. Second, one of the reasons for Haydn's enormous success in London was, as I've mentioned earlier, that he knew how to make the audience feel witty, perhaps wittier than they really were. And explaining one's jokes certainly isn't going to further that end. So he kept his mouth shut and made an outward show of deferring to their wisdom, never again writing a minor key symphony. Make of that what you will. I haven't said much about it during my running commentary, although I've dropped hints from time to time. At any rate, it would be a shame to neglect this symphony, for it certainly contains some of the most satisfying music I've ever heard, and the finale in particular ranks among those that are most likely to make me jump out of my very skin for joy. The recording is by George Szell and the Cleveland Orchestra, available on the Sony Classical label. I will take up the movements individually for comment, as usual. The first movement takes the standard sonata-form shape with a repeated exposition, although it lacks the slow introduction that had become fairly standard for Haydn by that time. It opens with a severe 5-note half-cadential motive in the home key, a gesture that I have again identified as an incipit. Anyone familiar with 18th century symphonic practice will recognize immediately that this motive absolutely begs for polyphonic treatment, and that will, of course, be forthcoming. A silence fraught with expectation follows that outburst, and the response is a sad, quiet C minor theme in the first violins. At that theme's cadential arrival, the incipit bursts in again, but is this time extended quietly, yielding a modulation to the symphony's relative key, E-flat major. The next tutti outburst does include that expected polyphonic treatment of the opening motive, but the real goal of the modulation is a theme that trips lightly and cheerfully in the mediant key. In my commentary, I have alluded to Beethoven in connection with that severe opening, and Rossini in the case of the present theme. Of course, Haydn wasn't channeling those composers, both of whose work lay entirely ahead of them, Rossini having been born only a couple of years before the symphony's premiere. But it does almost seem as though he forecast some of their identifying hallmarks. The development section is a fairly long and involved one, although no more serious in its sound than the corresponding sections of the two London symphonies I've dealt with earlier. At its recapitulation, the primary theme is extended a little, the transition is omitted, and the second theme returns in C major, thus reconciled to the whole, tonally speaking. The movement remains in that brighter major mode to the end, and one might well question whether there has been enough of a struggle to merit the apparent declaration of victory during the C major coda. Movement 2 is set in the symphony's mediant or parallel major key, E flat. This mediant relation is standard in minor key works of the period, so just as major key works will tend to focus on the dominant key as the most important secondary tonal area, minor key works will instead gravitate toward the relative major. This movement is in variations form with the thema, or theme for varying, set in 2 repeated strains, both of which are harmonically closed. The second strain is half again as long as the first, not an unusual proportion in Haydn, and affords some of the most beautiful 2-voice counterpoint you'll ever hear. The variations that follow are miracles of invention. The first includes an important role for the solo cello, an instrument you'll encounter again during the movement to follow. Variation 2 is set in the parallel minor. We saw the same in Haydn's Surprise Symphony. And the third variation returns the music to the movement's brighter tonic key. The coda contains some hints of parallel minor wistfulness, a feature I've pointed out earlier, and its ending can be understood, to my thinking, only in light of the interpretive proposal I offered in my earlier comments. The minuet movement returns to the symphony's tonic minor key. It is, in a way, the most serious movement of the four, although its jocular C major trio with its light-hearted cello solo certainly raises questions. The breezy final movement contains only the briefest hint of C minor darkness. It is, on the whole, one of the most glowingly optimistic movements you'll ever hear, and a trip through it never fails to make me feel glad to be alive. Its formal plan has apparently given some commentators difficulty, although it seems perfectly obvious to me. Haydn's model here is the rondo, with barely a hint of the more complex hybrid sonata-rondo approach that he himself had pioneered. The model is simple, A-B-A-C-A, with A indicating the refrain, whose last appearance inaugurates the coda, and B and C standing for contrasting episodes. Like the second movement's tema, the final movement's refrain is set up in 2 repeated strains, the second 3 times the length of the first. The first episode is a long one in 3 sections, the first and third of which are fugues. This section includes a modulation to G major, the most sonata-like thing about it, and a retransition in the wrong key, a musical joke that Haydn often employed. The refrain's first return is pared down to half its former length, its internal repeats having been omitted, and the second contrasting episode includes a brief stretch of furious C minor music whose modal corrective at the melodic peak is so thrilling I almost jump out of my skin every time I hear it. I don't know that I have anything further to add. This music is more than capable of speaking for itself, and my running commentary should furnish a sufficient guide to its formal scheme. Enjoy the ride.